I've kept this secret for nearly 80 years. You ever feel like the woods are watching you? Not just a feeling, something real. My name's Walter Hensley, and this is a story I've never told anyone but my grandson, and only when I knew my time was almost up. The truth is, what lives out there isn't a wolf. It isn't a bear, it's something else. I found footprints by the creek, massive, almost human, but the toes were spread wide like fingers. Deep, precise, fresh, nothing I'd ever seen in my 40 years living alone beneath the Oregon Cascades. I know these woods, every sound, every shadow, every track. And this wasn't natural. Stick around, and I'll tell you what happened the night it came right up to my cabin door. I'll show you the signs, the silence, the feeling in your gut when you know something's watching. Back in '56, I followed it for 3 days. What I saw still haunts me. Nearly 3 meters tall, dark fur, walking like a man. But it wasn't. I barely made it back alive. If you've ever camped in the woods or hiked off trail, you may have been watched too, and never even knew it. The morning after I found those strange footprints, the air still carried the chill of September. I remember my boots crunching over the brittle pine needles as I stepped off my porch, still thinking about what I'd seen. The tracks weren't just big. They were deliberate, heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had walked through my woods that didn't belong. But I had chores to do, and so I did them, though my mind wandered more than my feet did that day. I spent the morning splitting logs and stacking firewood along the cabin wall, every swing of the axe trying to push that unease out of my bones. I checked my traps again by mid-morning. Nothing caught, nothing disturbed. But I kept glancing at the tree line like I expected something to be watching. The forest had gone quiet again. Birds weren't singing, squirrels weren't chattering, just the wind brushing through the trees, soft like a whisper you're not meant to hear. By afternoon, clouds had rolled in thick over the Cascades. I sat on the steps with a mug of weak coffee, eyes scanning the edge of the woods. That's when it hit me. This land had always been wild, always held its secrets close. Maybe I'd stumbled onto one I wasn't meant to see. My instincts told me not to ignore it, but I wasn't ready to face the thought head-on either. You live alone in the woods long enough, you start questioning your own senses. You want everything to have a logical shape, a name, a reason. That night, I lit the lantern early. The shadows came quicker, heavier than usual, and I didn't like the look of the sky. I bolted the door and sat by the fire with my Bible open but unread, the words blurring as my thoughts ran circles. I could hear the wind shift outside, dragging across the roof in long, low moans. At one point, I thought I heard a branch crack. Not a sharp snap, more like a careful step. I held my breath. Nothing followed. I got up, walked to the window and pressed my hand to the glass. The darkness outside felt thick enough to hold its breath. I told myself it was just animals, just the mind playing tricks, but deep down I didn't believe it. Something had walked through my woods. Something heavy, something strange. And I had a feeling it wasn't finished yet. Before I went to bed, I checked the rifle leaning by the door, more out of habit than intention. I never had to use it on anything larger than a fox, but that night, I wanted to feel it close by. I lay awake long after the fire burned low, listening for a sound I couldn't name. My cabin, once a refuge, felt too small. The silence outside wasn't empty. It was expectant, like the woods were holding something in their lungs, waiting for the right moment to let it go. And I, fool that I was, had already stepped too close. It was maybe 3 nights after I found those tracks when I first heard it. I just banked the fire and was reading by lamplight, the kind of night where the cold presses in at the corners of the cabin and every creak of the timber feels louder than it should. I was halfway through the book of Psalms when something outside caught my attention. Not a rustle, not an animal call, but a sound soft and strange drifting in from the trees like smoke. It was faint at first, high-pitched, almost like a baby crying, but not quite. There was something off about it, something stretched and weary. The kind of sound that hooks itself into your spine without warning. I sat still, listening. The noise came again, closer this time, though still quiet. A whimper, maybe, or a low, drawn-out sob. It rose and fell like someone had lost their way and didn't know who they were calling for. I grabbed the lantern and stepped onto the porch, the boards cold beneath my feet. I held the light out toward the edge of the clearing. "Hello." My voice felt too loud, even to my own ears. No reply. Only that same broken sound floating between the trees. Not a scream, not a howl. Just something lonely. I stood out there for a long time, staring into the dark, waiting for a shape to move or eyes to shine back at me. But the woods stayed still. No branches snapped. No brush shifted. Eventually, the sound faded, and I went back inside, bolting the door behind me like it would help against whatever made that noise. I didn't sleep much. Every gust of wind sounded like breath. Every crack of the fire made me flinch. The next night it came again. Same hour, same soft moan like grief caught in a loop. It didn't grow louder or closer, just constant. I didn't go outside that time. I just sat in my chair and listened. The Bible shut on my lap. I was starting to believe this thing, whatever it was, wasn't calling for help. It was calling out of habit. Like it didn't know how to stop. By the fifth night, I started leaving things by the edge of the trees. Just scraps at first, a bit of jerky, a corner of stale bread, half a biscuit. I'd place them by a stump right where the clearing met the forest, and in the morning, they'd be gone. Not chewed up or scattered like raccoons would do. Gone. Clean, like someone had taken them with care. I started to wonder if I was feeding something that didn't want to be found, or if I was the one being watched. I didn't tell anyone, not that there was anyone to tell, but I started locking the door earlier, keeping the rifle loaded, and watching the fire burn down a little slower each night. The woods had taken on a kind of breathless hush, like everything around me knew something was near, but none of it wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Whatever was out there hadn't come any closer, not yet, but it had started a pattern, and I'd answered without even knowing why. It was just before dawn when I saw it. The sky was still dark enough to feel heavy, but the first hints of blue were brushing the tops of the pines, and the air clung to everything like damp wool. I was splitting kindling outside, breath fogging in front of me, when I felt it, that sensation, sharp and unmistakable, of being watched. It wasn't the first time I'd felt it, but this time, I didn't brush it off. I turned slowly, gripping the axe tighter without thinking, and that's when I saw the figure. It sat crouched low at the edge of the tree line, where my clearing faded into the deeper woods. Small, but not child small. Its arms were too long for its body, its shoulders narrow. The entire thing was covered in matted black hair, thin in places, tangled in others, and its body shook in the cold. But it wasn't fear that rooted me to the spot. It was the eyes. They were dark, too big for the face, and staring straight into mine. Not like an animal, not exactly. More curious than threatened. It didn't make a sound. It just looked at me like it had been trying to decide whether I was safe. My heart thudded in my ears, but I kept still. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe instinct, maybe mercy. I walked slowly to the stump where I'd been leaving scraps, same place every time, and placed a small slab of rabbit meat on top. Then I backed away, never turning my back to the thing. When I was a good 20 feet off, I stopped. The creature didn't move at first. It stayed low, almost trembling. Then, inch by inch, it crept forward. Its movements were cautious, uncertain. When it reached the stump, it sniffed the meat, picked it up in long fingers, and without so much as a glance back, vanished into the trees. I stood there long after it was gone, not out of fear exactly, though there was some of that, but because what I'd seen didn't fit into any frame of the world I'd known. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man, and yet there had been something unmistakably young about it. Lost, maybe even hungry for more than just food. That morning I didn't do much else. I kept replaying the image in my head. The way it moved, the look in its eyes, the strange gentleness in how it had taken the meat. I didn't tell myself I'd see it again, but I kept my routine, and I made sure come evening to leave more than scraps. Whatever it wasn't trying to hurt me. At least not yet. And if it came back, I wanted to be ready. Not with my rifle, but with something more important. Proof that I wasn't afraid. Proof that out there in the middle of nowhere, I was still willing to share a piece of what I had. Because something in those eyes had spoken loud and clear. It didn't want to be alone. And if I'm being honest, neither did I. It kept coming back. Not every night, not at first, but often enough that I started preparing for it the way you'd prepare for company. I began leaving more food out by the stump. Berries if I had them, a small hunk of cooked meat, bits of bread soaked in broth. Each morning the offering would be gone, never scattered, never half-eaten. Always carefully taken. I never saw it during the daylight, but I'd catch glimpses near dusk, a shape just beyond the trees, staying still until I looked away. It never crossed into the clearing, and I never stepped toward it. That space between us seemed sacred somehow, an agreement built on silence. But slowly, over days that turned into weeks, it started to linger longer. I'd catch it watching me from the shadows as I chopped wood or fed the chickens. Once I turned around and it was just sitting there halfway behind a tree, eyes locked on me. Not hiding, not afraid, just observing. I started talking out loud when I was alone, mostly out of habit. I'd mention what I was doing, tell old railroad stories I hadn't thought of in years, mumble about the weather or the trouble I had keeping one of the hens out of the potato sacks. I didn't think it understood me, not in words, but something in its eyes told me it was listening. Not just hearing, but really listening. Then the nights got colder. One evening, I was stacking fresh-cut logs when I saw it again, closer than ever, just inside the tree line. It was shivering. The hair on its arms hung damp with frost, and it looked smaller than I remembered, like the cold was eating through it faster than it could fight back. I didn't say anything. I just went inside, pulled an old wool blanket from the bottom of my trunk, and carried it to the fire pit out front. I built up the flames till they cracked loud and warm, then laid the blanket beside it and stepped back. I didn't expect it to come forward, but it did. Not all at once. It took its time, every step slow and uncertain. But eventually, it crept into the light, sat beside the fire, and curled up on the blanket. It didn't look at me. It didn't move once it was settled, just breathed, slow and tired, like it had finally found a place where the cold couldn't reach. I sat across from it, saying nothing, feeding the fire when it dimmed. The stars came out overhead, clear and hard as diamonds, and in that quiet, I realized something I hadn't admitted to myself. I wasn't just helping it survive. I needed this too. The cabin had never felt empty before. I'd built my life around silence, but now, with this creature near the fire, I felt something I hadn't in years. Purpose. Maybe even connection. It never spoke, never made a sound beyond breathing. But that night, as the wind howled through the trees and the flames cast long shadows across the clearing, I wasn't alone. And somehow, neither was it. I remember the way the wind shifted that evening. Sharp, sudden, like the woods had stopped breathing for a second too long. I'd been working on one of my traps just beyond the edge of the clearing, crouched low, fiddling with a stubborn coil of wire. The sky was starting to darken early, heavy clouds pressing low over the trees, and I was just about ready to pack it in when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the usual crack of a branch or rustle in the underbrush. This was deeper, a low, rumbling growl, close enough to feel in my chest. I froze. Slowly, I turned toward the sound, eyes scanning the trees, and there they were, two eyes glowing faintly in the last of the twilight, set low to the ground, unmoving. The shape stepped forward. A wolf, larger than any I'd seen in these parts, lean but muscular, and with a snarl curled on its lips. I knew better than to run. I didn't have my rifle. Left it leaning against the cabin wall like a fool. All I had was the knife on my belt and whatever nerves hadn't left me yet. Before I could stand, I heard another sound. A rustle behind me, fast and heavy, followed by a snort and a sharp, guttural bark. I turned just as the creature emerged from the tree line. It was the young one, my visitor, but it didn't slink or shy away like before. It came forward upright, no hesitation in its stride. It stepped between me and the wolf. The two faced off in absolute stillness. The wolf growled louder, baring its teeth, shifting its weight as if ready to lunge. But the creature stood tall, taller than I realized until that moment. Shoulders hunched, arms hanging but slightly raised. Then it made a sound I'd never heard from it before. A deep, echoing growl, rising from somewhere deep inside its chest. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated through the air like thunder before a storm. The wolf faltered. It didn't back away at once, but it lowered its head, unsure. The creature didn't move. It just held its ground, that low growl humming steady like the warning rumble of distant machinery. After a long few seconds, the wolf let out one final huff and turned, disappearing into the underbrush with a flick of its tail. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The creature turned toward me then. It didn't smile. At least not the way people do. But its eyes softened, just for a moment. Like it was checking to see if I was all right. Then it backed away, slipping into the shadows, silent once more. That night, I sat by the fire longer than usual, staring into the flames. I thought about everything I'd seen. The stance, the courage, the instinct to protect. It hadn't just saved me. It had chosen to. Somewhere between feeding it scraps and offering warmth, something had shifted. It wasn't just a wild thing anymore, and I wasn't just a man in the woods. We were something else entirely now. Bound not by words but by that quiet moment when it stood between me and danger, without a flicker of doubt. Spring came like a slow breath after a long silence. The snow melted from the roof in slow drips, and the air began to carry that smell of wet pine and new life. I remember walking out to the edge of the clearing one morning with a bowl of fresh berries and finding him already there, sitting in the sunlight like he'd been waiting. He looked stronger then. His fur had thickened, his limbs steadier. He didn't flinch when I sat beside him. He just watched me with those quiet, steady eyes. And I knew. It wouldn't be long now. I'd been preparing for it in my own way, stacking up the food stores, fixing the cabin roof one last time, pretending I was only getting ready for another season. But the truth was, I was getting ready to let go. He didn't belong beside a man with a limp and a lantern. He belonged to something bigger than I could ever hold. It was a morning like any other when I heard footsteps, heavier than his, slower. I turned, and there stood a creature taller than any man I've ever known. Broad shoulders, dark fur with streaks of gray, and eyes that matched the ones I'd come to recognize. Only older. It just stood there, looking at me with a calm I'll never forget. The young one rose to his feet slowly and walked toward it. They touched hands, if you can call them that, and something passed between them I'll never be able to explain. Not a word, not a gesture, but something deeper, something final. Before they left, he turned to me one last time, held my gaze. I don't know what he meant to say in that moment, but I felt it clear as day. I see you. I remember. And maybe, thank you. Then they were gone. The clearing felt impossibly still after that. For days I'd find myself pausing, waiting to hear that soft shift of weight just beyond the trees. But it never came. Life settled back into its slow rhythm. I kept feeding the chickens, chopping wood, mending the same pair of boots I'd worn every season since I got here. But it wasn't the same. I never told anyone. Not until now. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because I wasn't sure how to put into words what he meant to me. He wasn't a pet. He wasn't a child. He was something in between, a mystery I was lucky enough to touch, even for a short while. Years later, when I was older, slower, I found a footprint near the creek again. Larger this time, wider, pressed deep into the earth like a quiet hello. I didn't follow it. I just stood there, smiling to myself. I knew they were still out there, living free, the way they were meant to. And sometimes on the coldest nights, when the wind cuts just right through the cabin walls, I swear I hear it again. That soft, mournful sound I first heard all those years ago. Not crying this time. More like singing. You can believe it or not. That's up to you. But I'll tell you this, if you ever find yourself deep in the forest, and something watches from the shadows, don't be afraid too quick. Sometimes the wild is lonely. Sometimes it just needs someone to sit by the fire,